The marble floors of First National Bank gleamed under the soft glow of the chandeliers. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled financial machine, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the hushed conversations of tellers and customers, the occasional whir of a money-counting machine. Malcolm Avery, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a briefcase containing the documents he needed, approached the teller window with a confident stride. He was a regular customer at this branch, his family having banked here for generations. "Good morning," Malcolm said to the teller, a young woman with a friendly smile. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." He handed her his debit card, driver's license, and a completed withdrawal slip. The transaction was straightforward, a routine withdrawal from his own account. He'd done this countless times before. The teller, however, seemed flustered. "One moment, sir," she said, her smile faltering slightly. She disappeared into a back office, leaving Malcolm standing at the counter, a growing sense of unease creeping over him. After a few minutes, a man emerged from the back office. He was tall and imposing, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a severe expression. A name tag pinned to his crisp white shirt read, "Gordon Brewer, Branch Manager." "Mr. Avery?" Brewer asked, his voice cool and devoid of any warmth. "Yes," Malcolm replied, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm Gordon Brewer, the branch manager. There seems to be a slight issue with your transaction." Brewer proceeded to examine Malcolm's documents with an almost theatrical level of scrutiny. He held the driver's license up to the light, squinting at it as if it were a counterfeit bill. He compared the signature on the withdrawal slip to the signature on the license, his eyes darting back and forth with exaggerated slowness. "And what is the purpose of this withdrawal, Mr. Avery?" Brewer asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Malcolm, taken aback by the question, hesitated for a moment. It was a large sum, to be sure, but it was his money. He had every right to withdraw it without having to justify his actions to the bank manager. "It's for a personal matter," Malcolm replied, trying to maintain a polite but firm tone. "A personal matter?" Brewer repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Could you be more specific?" Malcolm felt a surge of irritation. This was ridiculous. He'd never been subjected to this kind of interrogation before. He looked around the bank, noticing that other customers, mostly white, were being served quickly and efficiently, without any undue scrutiny. "I don't see how that's any of your business," Malcolm said, his voice now edged with anger. "It's my money. I have sufficient funds in my account. I've provided all the necessary identification. I don't understand what the problem is." Brewer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "The problem, Mr. Avery," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone, "is that we have certain procedures we need to follow, certain regulations, and I'm not entirely convinced that this transaction is legitimate." The implication was clear. Brewer, based on nothing more than Malcolm's appearance, had decided that he was suspicious, that he was potentially a criminal, that he didn't belong in this bank, handling this amount of money. It was a blatant act of racial profiling, a thinly veiled accusation dressed up in the language of bank regulations. The quiet hum of the bank, the polite smiles of the other tellers, the gleaming marble floors. It all seemed like a cruel facade, masking a deep-seated prejudice that had suddenly reared its ugly head. Malcolm felt a wave of humiliation and rage wash over him, but he knew he had to remain calm. He had to fight back, not with anger, but with intelligence and determination. He was being tested, challenged, and he was not about to back down. Despite the surge of anger and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm him, Malcolm Avery forced himself to remain calm. He knew that losing his temper, reacting with outrage, would only play into Brewer's prejudiced narrative, confirming the bank manager's unspoken assumptions. He had to be strategic, methodical, and above all, controlled. "Mr. Brewer," Malcolm said, his voice even and measured despite the tremor in his hands, I understand that you have procedures to follow, but I assure you, this transaction is entirely legitimate. I've been a customer of this bank for many years. My family has banked here for generations. I have provided you with all the necessary identification, and I have sufficient funds in my account to cover this withdrawal. Brewer remained unmoved, his expression a mixture of disdain and suspicion. That may be so, Mr. Avery, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. But I still have concerns. We have a responsibility to protect our customers and to ensure that all transactions are compliant with federal regulations. And what specific regulations are you referring to, Mr. Brewer? Malcolm asked, his eyes fixed on the managers, refusing to be intimidated. Could you please show me the specific policy that justifies this interrogation? Brewer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting Malcolm to challenge him. He mumbled something about know your customer rules and suspicious activity, but he couldn't point to any specific regulation that Malcolm had violated. Malcolm pressed his advantage. Mr. Brewer, he said, his voice now carrying a hint of steel, I believe you are discriminating against me. I believe you are treating me differently than you would treat other customers, based solely on my appearance. And I will not tolerate it. He pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and purposeful. I'm going to make a call, he said, and I suggest you reconsider your position before I do. Brewer's face paled slightly. He clearly hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. He'd expected Malcolm to be intimidated, to back down, to accept his authority without question. But Malcolm was not backing down. He was fighting back. Malcolm stepped away from the counter, his phone held to his ear. He spoke in a low voice, his words brief and to the point. I'm at the First National Bank on Elm Street, he said. I need you to come down here immediately. There's a situation. He ended the call, his eyes meeting Brewer's across the lobby. The bank manager's confident facade was beginning to crack, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of fear. He had underestimated Malcolm Avery. He had mistaken his calm demeanor for weakness, his politeness for submission. He had made a grave error in judgment, and he was about to pay the price. The quiet hum of the bank, the routine transactions, the everyday normalcy of the scene were all a deceptive mask, concealing a drama that was about to unfold, a confrontation that would expose the ugly truth of prejudice and challenge the very foundations of power and privilege within those gleaming marble walls. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity of awkward silence. Gordon Brewer stood behind the counter, his face a mask of forced composure, trying to maintain some semblance of authority while nervously glancing at the entrance. Malcolm remained calm, standing near the teller window, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Brewer, a silent promise of retribution hanging in the air. Then the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a new customer. A man in a meticulously tailored grey suit, carrying a briefcase and an air of quiet authority, entered the bank. He scanned the room, his eyes quickly locating Malcolm. Mr. Avery, the man said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the silent lobby. My apologies for the delay. Traffic was heavier than I anticipated. He approached Malcolm, extending his hand in a gesture of respect and deference. The other customers, the tellers, even Gordon Brewer, watched in stunned silence. The scene, unfolding before them, was utterly unexpected, a dramatic shift in the power dynamic that left them reeling. Malcolm shook the man's hand, a slight smile playing on his lips. No worries, Mr. Thompson, he said. I believe we have a situation here that requires your expertise. Mr. Thompson, a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, turned his attention to Brewer, his expression hardening. Mr. Brewer, he said, his voice now laced with a steely edge, I am Mr. Avery's legal counsel, and I understand there has been some difficulty with a simple withdrawal request. Brewer stammered, his face turning a shade of pale that clashed. horribly with his neatly trimmed moustache. I was just following procedure," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to be careful. Regulations." "Regulations?" Mr. Thompson interrupted, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Avery is fully aware of banking regulations, Mr. Brewer, perhaps more aware than you are." He paused, letting his words sink. And then he delivered the final devastating blow. "Mr. Brewer," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "do you know who Mr. Avery is?" Brewer shook his head, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mr. Avery," Mr. Thompson announced, turning to address the entire bank, his voice now booming through the lobby, "is the majority shareholder and chairman of the board of Haven Trust, the holding company that owns First National Bank. In other words, Mr. Brewer, you have been refusing to serve, and in fact, discriminating against the owner of this bank." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the bank was fixed on Brewer, whose face had now turned a ghastly shade of white. He looked like a man who had just walked off a cliff, his world collapsing around him. He had picked a fight with the wrong man. He had harassed, insulted, and discriminated against the very person who held his fate, his career, his entire future in his hands. The irony was as thick as the silence, and the consequences, he knew, were about to be severe. The scene in the bank lobby had shifted from a tense standoff to a public reckoning. Malcolm Avery, no longer just a customer, but the owner of the bank, stood before Gordon Brewer, the branch manager who had so thoroughly disgraced himself. The other customers and employees watched in stunned silence, witnesses to a dramatic reversal of fortune. "Mr. Brewer," Malcolm said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of undeniable authority, "I believe you owe me, and everyone in this bank, an explanation." Brewer, his face still pale, his hands trembling, stammered, "Mr. Avery, I apologize. I didn't realize. I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Is it procedure to treat customers with suspicion and disrespect based solely on their appearance? Is it procedure to subject them to unnecessary scrutiny and humiliating interrogation? Is it procedure to deny them access to their own funds based on your personal biases?" Brewer was silent, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. He mumbled something about banking regulations and security concerns, but his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Mr. Brewer," Malcolm continued, his voice softening slightly but still carrying a steely edge, "what you did today was not about procedure. It was about prejudice. It was about implicit bias, the unconscious assumptions you made about me based on the color of my skin." He paused, letting his words sink in. He looked around the lobby at the faces of the customers and employees, a diverse group of individuals, all united by their shared experience of witnessing this blatant act of discrimination. "You saw me," Malcolm said, his voice now filled with a quiet intensity, "and you didn't see a customer, you didn't see a businessman, you didn't see a person, you saw a threat. You saw someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't fit your narrow definition of who should have access to wealth, to success, to respect." He stepped closer to Brewer, his gaze unwavering. "And that, Mr. Brewer, is the problem. That's the insidious nature of prejudice. It blinds you to the truth. It makes you act irrationally, unfairly and unjustly. It makes you treat people as less than human." He turned to address the entire bank, his voice now filled with a passionate plea for understanding. "We all have biases," he said. "It's part of being human, but it's our responsibility to recognize those biases, to challenge them, and to strive to overcome them. We have to do better. We must do better, not just for ourselves, but for our community, for our children, for the future." His words hung in the air, a powerful indictment of prejudice and a call to action. The silence in the bank was no longer the silence of fear and intimidation. It was the silence of reflection, of introspection, of a collective reckoning with the uncomfortable truth of implicit bias. Brewer, his head hung low, his career in tatters, was a living embodiment of the consequences of unchecked prejudice. And Malcolm, the man he had so unjustly targeted, had become, in that moment, a teacher, a leader, a voice for change. The immediate consequences for Gordon Brewer were swift and decisive. Malcolm, acting in his capacity as owner of the bank, ordered Brewer's immediate suspension, pending a full internal investigation. Security escorted the disgraced manager. From the premises, his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed world, shattered in a single devastating afternoon. But for Malcolm, this wasn't just about punishing one individual. It was about addressing the systemic issues that had allowed Brewer's prejudice to flourish. It was about creating a culture of fairness, respect, and inclusivity within the bank, ensuring that what had happened to him would never happen to anyone else. He convened a meeting of the bank's senior management team, his voice firm and resolute, as he outlined his vision for change. What happened today, he declared, was unacceptable. It was a violation of our values, a betrayal of our customers' trust, and a stark reminder of the work we still need to do. He announced a series of sweeping reforms. First, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees at all levels across all branches of Haven Trust. This training would focus not just on overt acts of discrimination, but on the more subtle, insidious forms of implicit bias that can shape perceptions and influence behavior. Second, a comprehensive review of the bank's policies and procedures, with a particular focus on identifying and eliminating any practices that could potentially lead to discriminatory outcomes. This included a review of loan approval processes, customer service protocols, and hiring practices. Third, the establishment of an anonymous reporting system, a confidential channel through which employees and customers could report any instances of bias, discrimination, or unfair treatment without fear of retaliation. This system would be independently monitored, ensuring that all complaints were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. "We have a responsibility," Malcolm told the management team, "not just to our shareholders, but to our customers, to our employees, and to the community we serve. We have to be better, we must be better, and we will be better." His words were met with a mixture of apprehension and cautious optimism. Some were resistant to change, clinging to the old ways of doing things. Others were eager to embrace the new vision, recognizing the need for reform and the opportunity to create a more just and equitable workplace. But Malcolm was undeterred. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. He knew there would be resistance, setbacks, and challenges along the way. But he was committed to the long haul, to building a culture of inclusivity and respect, not just within the walls of Haven Trust, but throughout the community it served. He had experienced firsthand the sting of prejudice, the humiliation of discrimination, and he was determined to use his power and influence to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same injustice. The journey would be long, but he was ready to lead the way, one step at a time, towards a better, fairer future. The story of Malcolm Avery's confrontation with Gordon Brewer and the subsequent reforms implemented at Haven Trust did not remain confined within the walls of the bank. It spread rapidly, first through the internal grapevine, then through the local community, and finally through social media and news outlets, becoming a powerful symbol of both the pervasiveness of racial bias and the potential for positive change. Within Haven Trust, the incident served as a wake-up call. Employees who had previously felt powerless to challenge the status quo now felt emboldened to speak out, to share their own experiences of bias, and to demand a more inclusive and equitable workplace. The diversity and inclusion training programs, initially met with some skepticism, became a forum for honest conversations, for challenging assumptions, and for building a culture of mutual respect. In the wider community, the story sparked a dialogue about racial profiling, about the ways in which prejudice can manifest in everyday interactions, and about the responsibility of individuals and institutions to actively combat discrimination. Local businesses implemented their own diversity training programs, community organizations hosted workshops on implicit bias, and schools incorporated lessons on cultural sensitivity into their curricula. Malcolm, often called upon to speak about his experience, consistently emphasized that the issue was not simply about one rogue employee, but about a systemic problem that required a systemic solution. This isn't just about Gordon Brewer, he would say. It's about all of us. It's about the unconscious biases we all carry, the assumptions we make, the ways in which we, often unintentionally, perpetuate inequality. He stressed that true justice was not simply about punishing the guilty, but about creating a culture where such behavior was unthinkable, where everyone felt valued, respected, and empowered. He challenged his audiences to examine their own biases, to engage in difficult conversations, and to actively work towards creating a more just and equitable society. Justice, he would say, is not a destination. It's a journey. It's not something we achieve once and for all. It's something we must constantly strive for, something we must actively cultivate in our workplaces, in our communities, and in our own hearts. He made it clear that Haven Trust, under his leadership, would be at the forefront of this effort. He committed the bank to ongoing diversity and inclusion initiatives, to partnering with community organizations, and to using its resources and influence to promote social justice. He wanted Haven Trust to be more than just a bank. He wanted it to be a force for good, a symbol of fairness, a place where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or social status, felt welcomed, respected, and valued. The story of Malcolm, Avery, and Haven Trust became a testament to the enduring power of individual courage, the transformative potential of collective action, and the ongoing struggle for a more just and equitable world. It was a reminder that the fight against prejudice is never truly over, but that every victory, no matter how small, brings us closer to the ideal of a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, free from the shackles of discrimination and injustice. The incident at Haven Trust, where Malcolm Avery confronted prejudice within his own institution, offers profound lessons, particularly relevant for those of us with a longer view of societal progress. It reminds us that the fight against discrimination is a continuous one, requiring constant vigilance and a willingness to act, even when facing established power structures. One crucial message is the power of quiet strength and strategic action. Malcolm didn't react with immediate anger, but instead calmly gathered information and used his position to expose the injustice. This highlights the importance of choosing our battles wisely, leveraging our resources and influence effectively. As elders, we have a wealth of experience to draw upon, allowing us to approach challenges with wisdom and strategic thinking. Furthermore, the story underscores the enduring need for empathy and the courage to challenge our own biases. Even with the best intentions, implicit biases can influence our actions. We must commit to ongoing self-reflection and be open to learning from others' experiences. Our lived experiences provides a strong foundation. Finally, Malcolm's actions. demonstrate that true leadership means creating systemic change, not just addressing individual incidents. He implemented training and reporting systems, ensuring lasting impact. This reminds us that true progress requires transforming institutions and culture, not simply reacting to isolated events. We can use influence to advocate systemic change.